Good morning, everyone. It is so nice to be here in cyberspace. Today is my second talk continuing on the Lotus Sutra, and I want to continue from where I was the last time, where I talked about my personal involvement with the Dharma and how I encountered the Lotus Sutra. I did cover a little bit of the basic Buddhist teachings, especially the Four Noble Truths. And you will remember that my assistant, Fred, was very instrumental in doing that. And Fred has insinuated himself into this situation to point out one of the topics that we will be covering today, and that is attachment, right? Because Fred is mesmerized by the screen, and not according to my will, but according to his, he came here and is trying to take over the lecture, but I won't let him. He can come back later. Is that okay? Yeah, it's okay. So exit stage left. No, it's this way. Oh, sorry. Okay, there goes Fred. He will come back. Have no fear. So just to go over the Four Noble Truths again, very quickly. The Four Noble Truths are a teaching which one could spend weeks, if not months on, but they are the truth of suffering, of stress, of dissatisfaction, and the truth of the cause of the suffering, and the truth that there is a way out, a cessation of the suffering, and then the last noble truth is the path of suffering. So it's not really just a basic teaching, it's an ultimate teaching, and it probably girds much of the lecture, and we will be coming back to it when we get to attachment. So these teachings are ultimately an analysis of how we got ourselves into the circumstances we find ourselves in. That's a mess for some people and the good life for others, but mess or good life, it's not going to last. I also spoke about the great vehicle, the revolutionary change in the Buddha's teachings, and I touched upon expedient means, the way in which the teachings are fashioned so that people can understand them using parables and stories and a variety of ways of reaching people at the place they are, at the level of understanding they can muster in a given moment. So today I want to dig a little bit deeper, and I hope to accomplish three things. I want to explain why the Lotus Sutra is a revolutionary sutra, and I will touch once again on the great vehicle, the central teaching of the sutra. And finally, I'm going to talk about attachment and maybe non-duality if I have time. That's what Fred was helping me announce. And when I do these talks, it's always very interesting because I never know quite what will happen until the moment, which I think is really in the spirit of a Dharma talk. And things turn out always, I think, for the better, but somewhat of a surprise. So I'm going to go and delve into the topic right now. So one of the things that I want to share with you is an understanding of who the participants are in the Lotus Sutra. This is very important and hinges on a lot of what the Lotus Sutra is teaching and the issues that it's bringing to the forefront. So here's a list of the participants. There's the Buddha, there are Shravakas, Bodhisattvas, and Prateka Buddhas. Now, I'm very aware that some people who are listening might not have much of a background in Buddhism, and these terms might be pretty unfamiliar, but I'm going to go over them, and hopefully you'll get the necessary understanding. So I want to also narrate the introductory chapter and understand some of the great innovations. that are happening in the sutra, because you can't really understand what a revolution is until you know what the revolution is overturning. And so I will talk about that to some extent. So let's talk about the participants. So one really interesting thing about the Lotus Sutra is the number of participants. It's actually incalculable, innumerable. There are beings that are listed in the millions and billions and trillions. This is no exaggeration. And distances and time are spoken about in vast, incalculable numbers. But the main participants in the sutra are the four that I mentioned. So let's begin with the Buddha, who is obviously the most important. But in the Lotus Sutra, interestingly enough, he actually puts the importance of the Lotus Sutra above his own position. It's a very, very interesting feature of the Lotus Sutra. So the Buddha has come into the world, and he declared he came to help the eminent and the humble, the high and the low, precept keepers and precept breakers, those of great character and those of imperfect and questionable character. And he also states that he wants all of these beings, no matter how high or low, to match his attainment, to become Buddhas themselves. That is inclusivity, and that is a message for our time. Democrats, Republicans, Americans, other nationals, conservative liberals, all welcomed by the Buddha. The distinctions are just not brought to the forefront. The distinctions are actually dispensed with. We're all sentient beings. So the other sentient beings that we're going to talk about are the Shravakas, the Pratyeka Buddhas, and the Bodhisattvas. And I want to go a little bit further into what the Buddha is. Sorry. So the Buddha is someone who realized his true nature, a nature that's fundamentally not different from our own. He purified all of his negative obscurations and suffering. He began, as we did, with all of the illusions and fears that we have. He developed wisdom and bodhicitta, that is the word for compassion and empathy towards others. And he vowed to attain enlightenment to overcome suffering and help all beings. He exemplifies purification and truth. He is exactly what he says he is. He's a Tathagata. That's a word that means thus come, thus gone, but what it means is basically what you see is what you get. And although, as the Lotus Sutra explains, what you see and what you get have to do with who you are and where you are at a particular point. Nobody can receive the entirety of the Buddha's teachings, no ordinary sentient being, and he makes that very clear. So the Buddha has the ability to manifest however he wishes and wherever he wants. And he uses expedient means, as I mentioned before, to reach sentient beings according to what their needs are. So he is really beyond, but not foreign to, the conceptual, the dualistic realm that we ordinary beings live in. The Buddha does not have a monkey mind. He has perfect concentration. He is not subject to the difficulties of samsara, the wheel of endless birth and rebirth, or the wheel of continually reduplicating unwholesome, unhealthy, unhelpful patterns that we often find we undergo in our lives. So he's not subject to the difficulties of samsara, birth, death, suffering. He manifests three qualities: boundless wisdom, boundless love and compassion, and boundless enlightened activities. This is what we see in the expedient means in the Lotus Sutra. And as the Lotus Sutra says, this Buddhahood is the destiny of us all. And I'm quite grateful for that. I'm glad that we're not going to end up as chopped liver or tofu, but that we can actually rise to our greatest potential, open our minds, and become the best that we possibly can become, and greater than we can possibly imagine. So that's the promise of Buddhism. So the Buddha discovered and recovered a solution for all of human suffering. In so doing, he became a rather extraordinary human being. He was not a god or a creator. He was someone with remarkable insight. He shared his insights with a group of followers, monks and later nuns, and he laid out extensive teachings which emphasized living a stable, moral life, developing the concentration of mind, and finally, a deep insight about how the mind works and how the world operates. The earliest practitioners, his first followers, taught and shared these teachings, but their practice, their understanding, at least from the point of view of the next school, and in some ways from the point of view of this sutra, they were somewhat circumscribed in direction, limited according to some views, and in that they only found their own salvation, and there was a potential that they had that they didn't realize. These practitioners are called Shravakas, and Shravaka is a word in Sanskrit which means sound hearers or heeders of the teaching, and which is what they did. They listened and followed the Buddha's very first sermons and practiced according to the way he outlined the practice when he first taught. And the Buddha taught for 45 years in the 6th and 5th centuries BCE. And for the Shravakas, their highest attainment was what is called an arhat. And an arhat is a noble one, someone who has attained full enlightenment. That's the ending of suffering from vexations, but not the same attainment as a Buddha. And eventually this body of teaching that the Shravakas followed was called by many different names. Mainstream Buddhism, Theravadan Buddhism, pejoratively called Hinayana, sometimes the teaching of the Nikayas. There's a kind of complicated historical history behind the teachings and how they are labeled. So the later teachings, which are what the Lotus Sutra is a part of, emphasize a seemingly wider view, emphasizing universal salvation. The highest ideal in this school was that of the Bodhisattva, someone who postpones his or her own enlightenment until all beings attain enlightenment. This body and teaching and practice became known as the Mahayana, which is a name that the Mahayana gave to itself, meaning the greater vehicle. And a variation of these teachings reached Tibet, and those teachings are called Vajrayana, sort of a variation on the Mahayana. And then there's one more path, one more character, if you will, that appears predominantly mentioned in the Lotus Sutra, and that is that of the Pratyeka Buddha, a solitary Buddha. These are somewhat elusive figures that seem to have a polemical role. Some teachings say that they appear in a time when there was no actual Buddha in the world, and that they figured out the way to enlightenment all by themselves, by observing phenomena in a very minute way. But they don't teach. So there are no sutras by Pratyeka Buddhas, as far as I know, and they're only mentioned in the literature, kind of as examples of a kind of limited understanding, as miraculous as it may seem to us. And there are no Pratyeka Buddha memoirs, and there's no Pratyeka Buddha school. Also, I just want to make clear that the definitions that I'm giving are the kind of definitions you might find in an encyclopedia. And I'm speaking of doctrinal differences only. So I'm not pointing to any particular group of practitioners. So the ultimate teachings in Buddhism, which exemplify the Buddha's middle way, kind of non-dualistic, non-attached understanding of the world, these tend to declassify people, not classify them, not put them into categories. So Ajahn Amaro, a Theravadan teacher, had an important article in Lion's Roar magazine about the prevalence of tribalism that can even affect Buddhism, where there is animosity and negative views from one group to the other. And of course, this is something that we're suffering from in America right now. And one aim of the Lotus Sutra is to cut through this animosity and distrust. And so these distinctions we will learn are a provisional reality. They are ultimately to be viewed as illusions, and I will talk about that a little later. Even the simple idea of a sentient being is an illusion. So there's a famous sutra called the Diamond Sutra, which proclaims that anyone who has this concept of a self or an other or a sentient being or a lifespan, they're really living in an unreal world. They're making distinctions based on assumptions of impermanence and assumptions of dualistic concepts. And this is not what the Buddha's ultimate teachings are about. But the Buddha is addressing us sentient beings who are caught in the web of these illusions. So to quote another great teacher, Ajahn Chai, he said, "Don't be an arhat, don't be a bodhisattva, don't be anything at all. If you are anything at all, you will suffer." And the Tang Dynasty Chan master Linji famously observed his students, and he said, "I, a mountain monk, tell you clearly, there is a true man with no rank, always present, not even a hair breadths away. He is always coming and going through the portals of your face." So Linji, an enlightened master, was very aware of the true nature of his students, even before they themselves had that kind of a realization. But this is the level that we're talking about in the Lotus Sutra, seeing past distinctions, seeing past conceptions. So now let's talk about some of the issues that are in the Lotus Sutra. So it's seemingly about a struggle between these different schools that I just talked about. That's not the entire sutra, of course. This is how the sutra is really introduced in talking about all of these teachings. Those are the Shravakyas, Pratyeka Buddhas, and the Bodhisattvas. Each one of those teachings is called a vehicle because the teaching conveys one from the shore of suffering to the shore of nirvana. At least that is the view of the early teachings, the Shravaka view. So together, all of these three vehicles are what the Buddha is talking about when the Lotus Sutra opens. And so in contradistinction to this amalgam of three vehicles, the Buddha proclaims the great vehicle that supersedes all of them. And so much of the first 10 chapters of the sutra can be described in this way, as dealing with many of these issues. And then later, the sutra turns all of these teachings on their head and announces even a new understanding of who and what a Buddha is. And you see that what you thought that you knew about Shakyamuni Buddha, the historical Buddha, and what you knew about enlightenment and almost everything else is wrong. It's later revealed that the Buddha is ever present in space and time and not apart at all from other Buddhas. So the sutra was nothing short of revolutionary to the early practitioners. It's just mind-blowing. So this might be very difficult for some of us contemporaries to understand, especially if you don't have much background in Buddhism. You might wonder kind of what the big deal is about, and to see how crazy this teaching seemed, at least in the polemics that that are being spoken about in the Lotus Sutra. As I said, the historical reality about how these schools actually dealt with one another it might be somewhat different, but the sutra is trying to bring home a point about what we should view and what is the proper understanding. So let me give you some idea of what kind of reaction that this revolutionary teaching might have brought. So imagine an Olympic gold medalist who won the decathlon, and they find out that he or she has won what they thought was a gold medal, but on closer inspection, it's a bronze medal. And running the marathon, for some bizarre reason, they only ran 21 miles, not 26.2. Or in another scenario, let's say there was a dodecathlon of 12 events, and the athletes somehow missed the last two. It's unthinkable, unacceptable, never even imagined. So, but that is the case in the Lotus Sutra, that these bodhisattvas, the Shravakas and the bodhisattvas actually missed the boat. So this is not a case like Rosie Ruiz, who was a runner, a woman who won the Boston Marathon in 1980. At least she won it for 8 days, until it was discovered that she had not run the race at all, but entered it near the finish line and pretended that she had run the whole race. These arhats, these are great practitioners who were sincere, indomitable of spirit, and spared nothing in reaching their attainment. But the Lotus Sutra shows that they were misled and did not achieve what they thought they had. So people react to revolutionary, show-stopping, gobsmacking news in different ways. Some people accept and embrace it. Others reject it and run away. In the second chapter of the Lotus Sutra, there are 5,000 monks and lay people who could not handle these new revelations. They did not want to hear it, as the Buddha is about to announce this new teaching. And they walked right out of the Buddha's discourse. They made a bow, but that was it. And whereas other practitioners, the great arhats, the great bodhisattvas, like Sariputra and Mahakashapa, they rejoiced at the news once the shock wore off. And especially when the news is not simply that your teachings misled you, but that if you put in more effort, if you really get in tune with this new teaching, then you too will become a Buddha. And the sutra, throughout the sutra, there are many, many prophecies of individuals getting the prophecy of Buddhahood and all of the names of the Buddha lands where they dwelled, and how long their reign is, and what the actual Pure Land, which is sort of what a Buddha land is called, what it actually looks like. So this is all spelled out very concretely in the Lotus Sutra. But, you know, as we can see, people don't really like news that they don't like. Look at how people are reacting to the COVID-19 virus. Some people are cautious, some people are in total denial, which may amaze some of us, but it seems to be the truth of what's actually happening. Generally speaking, we don't like to have our worldview and our sense of safety shaken in the least. So this is a really good point for me to segue into the teaching of attachment, because as I hope to show, that issue of being attached, you'll remember Fred's appearance, he couldn't tear himself away from the screen. That underlies much of what is going on in the Lotus Sutra. And if you'll remember my very brief summation of Four Noble Truths, if we talk about the second noble truth, which is the truth of suffering, and I'm sorry, which is the cause of the second noble truth is the cause of suffering. The first noble truth is the truth of suffering. But the cause of suffering, which in Chinese, the word ji means accumulation, which is even a better understanding, because there's so many causes and conditions that cause us to hold on to the views that we have, and to and which make us act in the ways that we act. So attachment is really the very mechanism that engineers our suffering, and a multiplicity of things go through our minds every moment. As a matter of fact, in the teachings, there are some descriptions of, in the blink of an eye, a million mind moments transpire in the mind. Our minds are always processing and reprocessing data. And the French philosopher Merleau-Ponty said, we're always acting on more information than we actually have. And this is very true of what's behind attachment. What we don't know, we fabricate, we assume, we speculate. All of these things which are taking us away from an actual confrontation and being with reality itself. So anyone who practices meditation, who tries to use a simple method like counting the breath, knows how difficult it is to control the mind. Not that we're trying to control the mind so much as to watch it and to understand it. It's a very important point to make. And if we did do this, which is what the Buddha accomplished and what we have the potential to accomplish, then we become that true man or woman of no rank that Linji spoke of. Someone who is living at ease in the moment. So let's go a little bit deeper into attachment. And now? No, not yet. Your time will come. Phooey. Sorry. Some people can't wait. More attachment. So let me actually bring this home in a more kind of visceral way, because from the beginning of this talk, I've really been just talking about concepts and ideas and a variety of things, which I find interesting. I hope you find interesting. Of course, it could put some people to sleep, but let's look a little bit about how we actually react to things in the moment. So if I hold this up, and you see that this is an elephant, of course. Now, if I call this an elephant, you might have some cognitive dissonance. with what you see and what your conditioning, your education, your experience tells you is in my hand. Of course, anyone with eyes could say that, can see it's not really, it's an elephant, it is a, but it's hard to get there, hippopotamus. Although, are you a hippopotamus? This is very hard to do. There we go. No, no. All right, it's hard to find hippopotami in my neighborhood. So here it is. You wouldn't give this a second thought, right? If I just held this up and said, it's an apple, right? But when it's misidentified, all of a sudden, it throws you off. And this is a teeny example of something which is, I hope, non-threatening, right? I hope people are not going to call these elephants for the rest of their lives. It's an apple. So we're conditioned by our upbringing, our culture, our personal fears, and our desires. There's a very long list that makes us see the world the way we see it, and so we see reality the way it isn't. So if you take just, if you think of a table, right, a wooden table, you know it's made out of wood, and you know that the wood comes from a tree and the tree comes from the earth. So by extension, and this is, people who are familiar with Buddhist lectures know that I could be venturing into the area of emptiness, which of course is the idea that we're labeling things the way that they aren't. So we would see tableness where there is nothing but this configuration of wood, which is a configuration of atoms and molecules. So provisionally, in the moment, well, it is a table, or at least that's how we would refer to it. That's how we would use it. That's what other people would see when they saw it. And it may be standing now, but there was a time when it didn't exist, and there will be a time in the future when it will cease to exist. So when we use the word table to describe it, we are making a hidden assumption. This is really something that we're not even aware. We're assuming that this really is just what we call it, and that it is permanent. And only if there was a very different kind of table that we might that was standing next to it, then we might start to differentiate and start to notice things that we wouldn't notice if we just saw an ordinary table standing in a bare room. And so, of course, if you ask somebody looking at a table like that, do you think that this table will last from now until the end of time? Of course, they'd have time to think of it, and most people would say no, it's not going to last like that. They wouldn't see it's the momentary nature of its existence, and more importantly, the momentary nature of our perception of it, which could change at any moment. You're looking at it and table comes into your mind, but then you get a phone call, or you think of something that happened 10 or 20 years ago. So the reality of our world is so determined by what's going on in our mind, and our mind is so impermanent, our thoughts are so impermanent and jumpy and scattered that it's no wonder that we fall back on our assumptions and our conditionings. So just think about if you're reading the paper or book and you see a typo, or you hear somebody mispronounce a particular word, or misidentify some place or concept that seems obvious to you. Not only is it off-putting, but if you watch your mind and you see how one instance of this can generate a multiplicity of feelings, thoughts, reactions. The technical word for this in Sanskrit is prapanka, this proliferation of thoughts. And just what happens with this misidentified apple or hippopotamus, whatever it happened to be, you can see how your mind can spin off in so many different ways. In Buddhist teachings, we begin to look at how our sense organs themselves process data and how we actually respond to that. I think everybody knows about optical illusions, which are showing, at least in the visual optical area, how our senses can lie to us. But according to Buddhist teachings, our eyes, our ears, our nose, our tongue, our body, and our mind can also lie to us. So in just once again, on a very mundane level, there's this thing called the Stroop effect, S-T-R-O-O-P, which I'm not going to display now, don't have the time. But that is this, this chart of spelled out colors like red, blue, R-E-D, B-L-U-E, but the letters are in the wrong color. And so you're asked to read the colors and not the word. And if you try this, which you can do if you Google Stroop, you'll find out how difficult it is. And we can really appreciate that on even this very mundane level, that our control of our senses, the information that our senses are giving us is questionable. Now, someone might argue that what I'm talking about is not exactly attachment, because the conscious mind is not actually making decisions, that there's no intentionality involved. And there's definitely something to that argument. But I remember Master Sheng Yen once saying that he didn't believe there was an unconscious, it's all mind. And so there is something to how we got where we are. And different people are fooled perceptually and conceptually differently from other people. And so this kind of attachment, this kind of delusion, illusion is a subtle form of suffering. Let me give another story. So this is something that will bring home how we perceive ourselves and other people. So this is something my father told me that happened many years ago. And when he was riding in a car with my mother, he and my mother in the back seat, and his friend Percy and his wife sitting in the front seat. Percy was a very colorful character. And at one point, someone cut him off, and Percy began cursing a blue streak, screaming every curse word known to mankind, I'm told. So his wife, who was a proper English woman, said, "Percy, he can't hear you." So if you think about it, you think about that as a paradigm, right, of things that we do all the time in everyday life. Our minds are, I mean, here's a case where he was actually shouting it out, but our minds are often shouting out things. Our minds are often in a state of rage as we read the newspaper, as we talk to people. Really would be out of control if it was expressed, but when we see it sort of shown in bas relief, kind of on litmus paper, so it stands out, then it's kind of astonishing. And then we can ask, well, who is listening as our mind shouts, as our mind speaks? And then we can also say, who is it who's talking? Who is that person? Is that person the person who is angry or sad? Does that define who they are? Well, we often take these states of mind that we find ourselves in, and we identify with them. You know, so we say, "I am angry," "I am sad," rather than a more Buddhist view of it. Anger is arising in me. Sadness is arising in me. So these attachments also just work in our assumptions. We don't see the other side very well. So here's a great story from the Mullah Nasruddin, who's a character in Sufi stories, who was a teacher in the Middle East, and he's sort of known for a kind of crazy wisdom. So he's talking to one of his students. He's a kind of middle-aged man in this story, and they're at a cafe somewhere in Egypt, and the student is saying, "Mullah, how come you never got married?" And the Mullah Nasruddin thought for a moment and said, "Well, I really wanted to, but I was looking for the perfect woman." And he said, "Well, now in Beirut once, I met this woman who was really gorgeous. I was very attracted to her, but we had nothing to talk about, so that didn't work out. And then another time in Cairo, another city, I met this woman who I just felt so close to. I really engaged with her, but there was no chemistry. There was no attraction. She wasn't the perfect woman." And then finally, I was in Alexandria, and I met this woman who was the woman of my dreams, the perfect woman. She was gorgeous, engaging, intellectual, kind, everything I could have wanted. So the friend said to him, "Well, why didn't you get married?" And the Mullah Nasruddin takes a sip of his tea and he says, "Alas, she was looking for the perfect man." So this is once again a way of seeing attachment. We see the world only from our own side, and there's so many examples of this in terms of psychological experiments with the Dunning-Kruger effect, where people so misunderstand and misperceive their own abilities. These are the experiments where engineers, for example, are questioned about where they see themselves in their field. And the statistic was that 50% of engineers believe that they're in the top 5% of their profession. So their perception is very skewed. It's fabricated. And we can see how some of these are somewhat benign or whatever, but when we see how these assumptions become symbolic, then it becomes much more pernicious, especially in our society. Look at Colin Kaepernick, the quarterback who just changed his body position by 12 or 15 inches, and whatever particular side of the political spectrum you're on, you can see the uproar that happened over that. And Black Lives Matter, which should just be a corrective to a historical injustice, but for some people it is perceived as quite the opposite. The Confederate flag now, seen understandably and rightly so in my mind as a racist symbol, but there was just an article about how Confederate soldiers in the 1860s moved to Brazil and kept the flag and certain trappings of the Confederacy, but the state of racial relations there is very different. So they perceive it differently, even though of course there is a call for them to drop that symbol. And even really interestingly, the swastika is a very important symbol in Buddhism. And there's a long article that Master Sheng Yen wrote about how the swastika is representative of wisdom and compassion. Now, obviously, and it's also turned a different way than the Nazi symbol. But you can see how those lines that make up the swastika have no meaning in and of themselves, but they are perceived very, very differently. And so just to finish this, it's getting somewhat close to time when I want to take questions. So this is a good time to actually jump back into the Lotus Sutra and talk about how attachment underlies what's going on. Now, I wanted to talk about a lot of things in the sutra, and there's just not enough time. So I'm going to skip to the third chapter, which has the most famous parable, arguably, in the whole sutra. It is the story of the burning house. And very simply, that is a story of, which involves Shravakas, Prateka Buddhas, and Bodhisattvas. But this is a parable of a wealthy man who happens to be the Buddha, but in the parable, he's just a wealthy man who has this house, which is in really bad shape. The house represents our world and samsara. And not only is it in bad shape, but it's been set on fire. And this wealthy man's children are so engaged in their pursuits that they don't see the fire. They don't perceive it. And of course, it's somewhat understood that their pursuits are the practices of the three vehicles, but they are oblivious to what's going on around them. So what the Buddha does, the wealthy man, is he uses expedient means, and he promises these children carts, an ox cart, a goat cart, a sheep cart, if only they will come out of the burning house. So, so he understands them, and he's able to entice them out. And then there is the question in this chapter: did the Buddha actually lie to them? And of course, it's understood that he was reaching them in a way that they could be reached, and his intention was not malicious at all. It was utterly beneficial, and the outcome was wholesome and good. Now, if you look at that story, just reading through the sutra, you might get caught up in the idea that it's trying to distinguish it between the traditions, and it's talking very much about a particular type of practice, the great vehicle, which is true. But looking at it from the angle that I've come into it, you can also see how it's about attachment. It's about how people are caught up in their own activities, oblivious of the world, unaware of what's going on around them, unaware of the harm that they may be confronting themselves, and unaware of the harm they may be inflicting on other people. So there is really a very wide view of what attachment can be. It can be seen in so many things in our world culturally, and it's in our language. It's in the way we use words, and it's in the way that our mind operates. It's so this teaching that is in the Lotus Sutra, this parable, and a lot of what the Lotus Sutra is talking about, is really very, very practical. It's really pointing us to look at the way that our minds work, and how we hold on to things, and how we're not even aware of how we're holding on to things. And so, and disappointment. You didn't get your chance, did you? No. Well, next time. Resignation. Sorry. As he sinks into the sunset, I'd like to close my my talk now. I want to thank everybody who has stayed with me, and I'm perfectly open to questions. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Harry, for such an informative talk. Now let's see, we still have 10 minutes left for Q&A. So anyone who wants to ask Harry questions, this is now a good time. Just raise your hand. Okay, I see Simon raised his hand.
Okay.
Hey, Mr. Miller, thank you again for your time today.
Oh, hey, Simon.
Very delightful conversation. I just wanted to share that, you know, I normally reside in Queens, but right now in Massachusetts. And during your talk, you know, especially on, you know, the Buddha giving the sermon, and then the people walking out, bowing and walking out, I was just kind of sitting here looking up at the trees, the clouds kind of going by and morphing, really getting into it, you know, thinking that this is what I want to be, you know, this contentedness is where I want to be all the time. And then suddenly my 3-year-old interrupts me and starts moving chairs around, and, you know, that sort of aggravates me momentarily, you know, and then I realize that she's just a 3-year-old, you know, and I can't expect her to be a certain way. I have this image of what a good 3-year-old is supposed to be like, and I'm attached to that, right? And I just have to remind myself that it's not like that all the time. So, and then I appreciate that you went into the attachment part of it, and kind of putting it to more kind of practical sort of means. So yeah, I just wanted to share that and say that I appreciate your talk today.
Thank you. I appreciate your insight in the way that you were able to show how you kind of reacted to it personally. So that's very helpful.
Harry, this is Marvin. Can I ask one question?
Please.
Okay. I hear lots of your talk about the Lotus Sutra, but
Yes.
you know, most of the Lotus Sutra, they are beautiful, they are story-based, but how do you transform the Lotus Sutra, for example, the burning house, into your actual practice so we can benefit through the doctrine come from the Lotus Sutra, but also we can apply that to our daily life?
Okay, well, one of the things that I mentioned earlier that I have been talking about the Lotus Sutra for a while, and I was going through chapter by chapter doing a close analysis. And, you know, it does get somewhat abstract, but well, what I was trying to show in my talk today was how if you look at the underlying themes that are happening in the parable, right? So there is the prodigal son in the 4th chapter who's sort of walked away from his birthright, and there are other things of people who find the man who had this jewel in his jacket and didn't realize it. If you can somehow internalize and really look inward and see how that metaphor operates in your own life, if indeed it does. You know, the Buddha said that a mind apt in metaphor is in concert with enlightenment. So these, it takes multiple readings, real contemplation of the sutra. It's something Gilbert Gutierrez is always talking about, of trying to just see how the sutra sinks down within you, and you try to release even your attachments and assumptions about what you're reading, so you can really see what's inside you.
Can we take like one sample, like chapter 16? We're talking about the Buddha as he will never die. He is always in somewhere trying to teaching people to become the Buddha nature. We understand on the chapter 16, but once we continue reading that, so how does that, there's no aim for the Buddha's life, and he can transform to any form to teach the people like us to move towards to the Buddhism, but how does that meaning for us in a daily practice? Should we just believe that, or should we have an actual action upon into understand that chapter?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. So in chapter 16, yeah, and that's I'm concentrating in this series sort of on the first half, but in chapter 16, with that announcement of the Buddha, of course you can ask this question about should you believe these things which are way beyond all of our experience and our perceptions. I think I speak for a lot of people. We haven't seen the Buddha in celestial trappings, but you can still look at that as a teaching about attachment, because you can see how you react to those kind of claims. And also the underlying thing is when you view a chapter like that, you start to see, well, what am I holding on? What kind of things am I so absolutely certain about that I cannot let go? Right now, I'm not claiming that you simply believe these stories, but I don't think that's quite how they're meant. I mean, not at least in the way that I'm interpreting. I think you see what they bring up in you, right? And on any different level, if you're worried about how are you going to become the Buddha, or simply you're reading about the Buddha and your toaster oven is on the fritz, or someone's calling you up for a bill, how would that help you? But I think it does in many ways, in that you can have this faith, which I haven't really spoken about in the Lotus Sutra, but you can also, once again, see what you're holding on. How are you taking the things in your own mind right now and distorting them, expanding them, causing yourself to suffer? So I could talk about that for a long time, but that's a short answer.
Thank you, Harry, because sometimes when we practice the chant, mostly they are very concrete. Then when we learn, for example, for the 3 Dharma principle, we also understand because we can test it or observe with our daily life. But for the Lotus Sutra, it just, they're so beautiful, so many good stories, but when we try to practice, are kind of like a lost in the jungle.
Yeah, well, as I said, I can understand that, but it's really a question of reading it and just looking deeper, and looking to yourself. Okay.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, so Harry, I got a question from the chat room. Someone asked, can you recommend a translation of the Lotus Sutra to read in English?
Yes, I will. I'll show you. It's right here. This is Gene Reeves' translation. It's probably the most recent, and it's very readable and really quite accurate as far as I can see. I mean, I've gone to the Chinese a number of times. There's also a translation by Leon Hurwitz, which is very helpful also because it includes Chinese and Sanskrit. And Burton Watson, who was the famous translator from Columbia, he also translated it. But I found this one to be very helpful.
Okay, it's almost time. I saw someone raised up her hand, and this will be the last question.
Okay, sure, please.
Hi, Harry. Really appreciate your talk. I think I heard in there not just the story and the beautifulness of it, but I also heard Dharma-based points in there. The history, the type of study path, and the all the stuff that many things that you mentioned. Actually, I see the Dharma based on that. So I think this is a very I'm not a Chan master's learner, so that's why maybe I see this more than being a Chan master. So I haven't seen the Chan master's path of that. But I think that the story triggers people's interest in learning what Buddhism is, and I see a very good use of the story matching to the sutra, a simple verse of the sutra to teach to our youngsters. You know, I really would love our third generation, second generation children be able to be exposed to this, but there's not a good teaching material a lot of time to attract their attention. So I really wanted to putting my pluses and support to this. I think this is a very, very, will be a very helpful and teachable material. I think that's that. Yeah, thank you again. I enjoyed the talk very much. I missed your first one, but I'm glad I caught this one.
Great. Well, you know, you're demonstrating right there expedient means in showing how you can, you know, in a sense, you can become a part of the sutra. You know, the sutras say, the Diamond Sutra says that Buddhas and Bodhisattvas emerge from the sutra, and the Lotus Sutra, of course, makes that claim as well. So thank you very much for your observation.
Great. I think all of one really had a great time, and we will continue next time.